Welcome to the Policy Council. My name is Opeyemi Agbaje. A few days ago, I was at the Bola Tinubu colloquium, and the main speaker spoke about poverty and the Nigerian state. I thought that his views were things that we should share with the audience on the Policy Council. He's my guest today. Enjoy the program. You're welcome back. It's the Policy Council. My name is Opeyemi Agbaje, and we're discussing poverty and the Nigerian state. My guest is a friend of mine. He's a chartered accountant. He's an experienced consultant. He's the managing director of Frontier Capital, Femi Edu. Femi, you're welcome to the Policy Council.
Thanks very much, Opeyemi.
So you had this presentation. I was in the audience. I was a former speaker at the Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu colloquium.
Yes,
on poverty and the Nigerian state. It was interesting, and I thought that we should share that with our audience. What was the central theme of your presentation?
Well, essentially that we have had sustained economic growth for several years now. We've had sustained economic growth, and there's a clear trajectory, a trend line that shows clearly that we've moved GDP from about $280 in 1999 to roughly 1,500 by last year.
Per capita.
Per capita.
Yes.
Based, of course, on the official GDP numbers, which will be rebased this year, based on the official population numbers, which, you know, we always continue to quarrel about. But if we look at those numbers, right, clearly we've had something like a 5-fold improvement in average incomes. Even though what that has done is to take us back to the peak that we achieved in the 70s, according to the World Bank. But all the same, that's still a significant achievement.
Yes. So
the question really is, why has that not been accompanied by a corresponding 5-fold improvement in the quality of life? That was the basic thing.
Why indeed has poverty gotten worse over the same period?
But irrespective of all of the disputes about the numbers, I think one of the things that is clear is that there's a significant level of poverty that seems to be entrenched, and that GDP growth has not dislodged. So that's really the issue.
That's really the you started your presentation with a shocking contrast of images: extreme squalor, extreme wealth, development via Ikoyi, extreme poverty. How do you explain the path Nigeria took to creating these extremes?
That we are in a nation where there is significant inequality, where the level of people's participation in the process of governance is low, where the quality of life and the indices of human development are low, and where we have not achieved an institutional consensus around the things that we need to do to transform our nation. And that's why we see Nigeria running, as it were, on two parallel tracks.
And obviously you say that this has something to do with politics. Does politics matter?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Now, if we step back and take a purely common sense view of this thing, the reality is that economic policies don't just make themselves.
They are made in a political context.
They are made in a political context.
Political objectives.
Exactly. That's why I started my presentation at the birthday colloquium by quoting from Why Nations Fail. The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty by, Darren Akemoglu and James Robinson. It says achieving prosperity depends on solving some basic political problems. Economics has assumed that the political problems have been solved, right? But really, that assumption does not hold in reality.
And Nigeria is a perfect example.
The problems don't solve themselves spontaneously. There's got to be a deliberate effort to solve the problems. There's got to be a deliberate initiative, okay, to create policy conditions and a certain context within which economic policy is formulated. Ordinarily, that's something that should be done by political parties.
In Nigeria, political parties don't discuss policy.
I think it is absolutely necessary now that we are able to make political choices on the basis of the policy options that the parties present to us as the people.
Which makes it imperative that the parties present policy options.
Yes, and it is imperative on the people themselves, you know.
To demand policy options.
Yes, the old sage said that people get the government that they deserve. So the people themselves must now begin to say, what exactly is your vision for the nation? What exactly is your plan? And how will you implement these plans?
Let's take a short time out and we'll go into this poverty data and the Nigerian state with Femi Edun. We'll be right back. You're welcome back. It's the Policy Council, and I still have Femi Edun, and we're talking about poverty and the Nigerian state. Femi, so what's this thing called poverty? How do we define it? Do we have an agreed definition, benchmark for what poverty is?
There are qualitative definitions of poverty that talk about the deprivation when basic human needs, food, you know, safe drinking water, sanitation, health, shelter, education, and information. These are the things that will be lacking when people are living in poverty. There are the quantitative definitions as well. The international poverty line of extreme poverty at $1.25 a day, based on purchasing power parity, and the various countries, you know, in the UK, where if you are earning below 60% of the median income, you are poor. If you are in the US, if you know, a certain proportion of your food spending determines whether you are poor or not. I guess in Nigeria, whether you earn the minimum wage of 18,000 naira a month determines whether you are poor or not. So,
but objectively, the minimum wage is a poverty wage, isn't it? Well, 18,000 naira.
If you translate the minimum wage in international or into US dollars,
yes,
it is well above the poverty line. It's about $3.75 or so a day. That's what it translates into. So I mean, the question then becomes: is it that those people are not extremely poor, or is it that they are moderately poor, or is it that
they are near poor?
You know, emerging middle class. What exactly does it mean? Any way you look at the numbers, whether it is the number of people living in poverty, whether it is, depending on whose statistics you look at, whether it is the international poverty line, whether it is our GDP per capita figures, we are a poor nation on average.
And then we have these definitions of relative poverty, absolute poverty, dollar per day poverty.
That's right.
And obviously I'm a bit familiar with these figures. Whichever measure you take,
we're poor.
The data says about 60% of Nigerians are poor.
Well, some data says it's 48% of people, some say 42% of people, some say it's, you know, close to 70% of the people who are living in poverty. You know, but irrespective, bearing in mind that there are over 150 million of us.
That's a large number of people.
If it were only 20% living in poverty, right? That's more than the population of Ghana. That's 30 million people. Okay, so when you translate those numbers into lives, into people, into families, we're talking about a serious crisis in the human condition.
Again, my question is, how did we get there? We didn't have these levels of poverty at independence. We didn't have them in 1968 during the Civil War. We didn't have them until after we discovered oil. How did Nigeria produce shocking levels of poverty in the midst of shocking levels of income?
Well, it's one of the things that you know, the World Bank studies have shown, and they were making the point that the income levels that we have now attained are the same levels that we had attained by the mid-70s. So there has been a failure of growth, as it were. The 1980s, of course, were a lost opportunity. Most of the 90s were a lost opportunity. Many of those of us who stayed back and didn't go into the diaspora have evidence from our lives to show for that.
That we basically spent 20 years,
you know,
moving backwards,
running to stand still. In 1980, according to the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, about 73% of Nigerians were non-poor, which means that only 27% were living in poverty. Now, by 2010, according to the same Bureau of Statistics, the proportion of non-poor was 31% of the population.
So we had
While
flipped.
69, we had basically reversed that relationship between the poor and the non-poor. That's what happened between 1980 and 2010.
And probably you would have to link this with prices of oil, structural adjustment.
So we can link that with oil prices, we can link it with the structural adjustment program, we can link it with the problems of poor governance and corruption, and the misappropriation of resources. We can link it with the lopsided nature of the spending out of the public treasury.
Precisely.
So these are all causative factors. We can also link it with the fact that the mainstay of our economy, certainly in terms of its relationship with the rest of the world, is crude oil. Even though, you know, agriculture is supposed to be more than 40% of our GDP, oil still accounts for
85% of income.
More than 90% of our earnings, our foreign exchange earnings. So how many jobs does the oil industry create?
So this is about inclusivity of the growth that we're talking about.
Yes, yes.
Let's take a short break. We'll come right back and drill deeper into this phenomenon of poverty in the midst of plenty. We'll be right back.
Hey, welcome my son.
We are giving free textbooks in our school today.
I thank God. I know with this Lagos State government free education, my son will end up being a lawyer or medical doctor. He can even become an educated automobile engineer. My son tell me, say, their school don't get beautiful building with a better chair and desk, new library, computer for everywhere, laboratory today. My people, all these things our children they enjoy today, now our tax money do more, I they pay my tax.
Pay your tax. It's your civic responsibility. It's your duty. It's the law.
You're welcome back to this sober discussion on poverty and its effects on the Nigerian people. Femi, I've made an argument once before, and I recently made it again to some minister of the Federal Republic, that we should stop talking about GDP growth. We should stop celebrating 6.5%, 7.5% GDP growth. That we should focus on human development indices, social investment, education, health, water, these things. What do you think?
Well, you can't have one without the other. The reality is that there's a symbiotic relationship between growth and development. Human development, for it to be sustained and for it to translate into a sustainable and a marked increase in the quality of life of the people, has got to be driven by economic growth. It is economic growth that translates into human development. But human development on its own also accelerates the rate of growth.
Let me advance my perspective further. The problem is the structure of an economy with us, in which 80 to 85% of that GDP that you're celebrating is made up of 4 sectors: oil and gas, agriculture, which is submodern, which perpetuates poverty, retailing, which adds no value, creates no jobs,
I disagree,
and telecoms, which again, how many people can it employ? So you have 85% of this growth you're celebrating in sectors that don't create jobs, that don't have linkages with people, that don't redress poverty, and that basically are diverse from the well-being of the people. Now, that growth, should that growth be your objective, the focus of your policy? Except perhaps you can have, why don't you focus on what the end is, in the improvement of life of the people? What do you say to that?
I think it's got to be pretty much like the analogy of a dashboard and a driver. You know, you're driving, and to drive safely, you're focusing on a number of things: road conditions, and you're also looking at the conditions in the car. So you're looking at your speed, you're looking at your temperature, you're looking at your fuel gauge, and all of those things are helping you, to navigate safely and to keep your car on the road. I think it's the same way when you're running an economy, or when you're managing an economy. We cannot look at economic growth on its own. We cannot look at the human development indices on their own, because they do have a symbiosis between them. So we've got to keep looking at both. So I would rather say that the argument should be that we should emphasize tracking the human development indices as much as we track, our GDP growth number.
My perspective is that doing nothing, GDP growth in Nigeria will be 5%. So yeah, do one or two things, it will be 7. So it's convenient for a policymaker to just keep focusing on that when he sees human development sliding. Our HDI, and I want your comments on this, is lower than Cameroon, than Kenya, than Egypt, and then all these places.
Yes, we're in the basket of the least developed on the HDI index globally, and our human development index is less than 0.5, is 0.456 or 0.459 or something like that. So it's low the human development side by side with high GDP growth.
Exactly.
And that's why we've got to deal with the issue there. There are issues relating to the structure and the quality of growth. Unfortunately, time didn't allow me to get there in my presentation, but I sort of alluded to the fact that that paradox of growth and development need not necessarily be so. There are a number of contrarian views out there. Neil Ferguson, in his book Civilization, analyzing the rise of the West relative to the rest, which, according to economic historians, is not been there for that long. It's a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of economic history of the world. China was a lot more advanced than the West, before the Middle Ages. But one of the things that he identified there, and when you talked about retail earlier, he identified the rise of the consumer society as one of the things that has accelerated the growth of the West. And I do agree, because one of the things that retail does is that it creates jobs very quickly, very efficiently, very cheaply. Okay, and those are jobs that young people can do as they go through the educational process. They're jobs that young people can do as they take a break from their education. And if you bear in mind the fact that we do have a population bulge, our youth are the bulk of the population in Nigeria. We have to create those jobs, and agriculture alone will not do it. And that's why we've got to start rethinking all of this protectionist approach that we have to trade. Retail, and expanding retail in Nigeria will create hundreds of thousands of jobs very quickly. I dare say millions of jobs across the country.
Okay, let's take a short break and we'll come back for the final segment with Femi Edun, and in which we'll focus on solutions and recommendations. How do we solve this problem of poverty? We'll be right back.
Who knows Abi better thing? Abi who no like better thing? All these fine things where they see so. Now money government they take do am now. Abi, I think it's like, excuse me, I dey pay my tax. I dey do it, I dey pay my tax. Say you don't pay your own tax. If you pay your tax, I pay. Oh.
Pay your tax. It's your civic responsibility. It's your duty. It's the law.
You're welcome back to the Policy Council, this final segment with Femi Edun, where we talk about solutions. But first, Femi, one of the things you brought out were some weak institutional elements of the Nigerian situation that contribute to the situation we find ourselves.
Yes. Yes. I talked about the fact that achieving a political consensus and strengthening governance means that sometimes the fiscal building blocks of the government themselves need to be strong. I highlighted the fact that from a fiscal perspective, the federation is weak because we have federating units that cannot stand on their own. I highlighted dependence on the federal allocation for revenue in the states, and the fact that the 3 states that are least dependent, Lagos at about 24% of revenue, Abia at 55%, and Ogun at 56% of revenue, were themselves still not, apart from Lagos, that is head and shoulders above everyone else, themselves are still not shining lights of fiscal independence.
Exactly.
Because what we learned from basic political theory was that federating units should be strong enough to stand alone on themselves, by themselves.
Both politically and economically.
Both politically and economically. And economically, our federating units are not independent, cannot be independent. So their ability to be strong contributors to the national discourse and the national consensus is limited by their dependence on the center. The other thing that I talked about was the fact that we really are not a taxpayer stakeholder economy from the viewpoint of taxation. We depend on oil prices for the bulk of our revenue. The price of oil is outside our control. The volume of oil that we pump largely is outside our control, except to the extent that we reduce it by unrest. Okay, but if you look at the indicators, even in Africa and our comparator countries, tax as a contributor to GDP in Nigeria is about 6%. In South Africa is 27%. In Ghana is 21%. In Brazil is 34%. In the UK and the US is 26% and 39%. Ours is 6%.
So are people
really
are diverse from the polity?
Exactly. Exactly. The fiscal reality in the public space is something that people are not really stakeholders in. To the extent that our taxes don't really matter. And that perhaps
explains corruption.
Our taxes don't really matter that much. Okay, that's why we see the government money as the national cake to be shared, rather than the national cake to be baked.
Okay, so let's talk about solutions. What do we do with all this myriad of problems, with poverty, unemployment, with a weak state, with people who don't pay taxes? What are your solutions? How do we deal with poverty in the Nigerian nation?
Like I said, there has to be governance. There has to be a consensus around the framework and the paradigm for governing this nation and transforming the quality of the lives of our people. The people are going to have to participate, and we're going to have to get advocacy to rise up to levels where it will make a difference in the thinking of the political class. Pressure has got to be put in the public space on the people who aspire to lead us to form a consensus around the things that we need.
Policy.
Yes. The 1996 Human Development Report of the UNDP, you know, when it's talking about growth and what I call the 5 horsemen of growth, it's sounding really more like a religious sermon or a politician's speech than, you know, a serious economic report, because it talked about growth, you know, and the type of growth when structure and quality of growth is not addressed, the type of growth that causes the paradox that we see of growth without development. And it identified, you know, 5 types of negative growth, or 5 types of growth that are not reinforcing and conducive for development. Yes, jobless growth, where growth is happening, but we're not really expanding, you know, the job base. Where growth is ruthless in the sense that the fruits of growth are not beneficial to the people. So it's extractive and exclusive. Voiceless growth, where growth is happening but people are not really getting their voices heard more.
Maybe China.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yes. Maybe Nigeria.
Maybe Nigeria.
Ruthless growth, where growth is damaging people's cultural identity and their values, and really making them rootless and stateless and valueless people. And then futureless growth, where growth is happening at the expense of the next generation, because we are stealing from our children.
Probably all these categories are applied to Nigeria.
I would say that they do.
Femi Edun, on that sober note, thank you for coming on the Policy Council.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. The paradox of growth, economic growth, in the midst of increasing poverty is one Nigeria cannot afford to perpetuate. And inclusiveness in this growth will not happen on its own. Policy has to make conscious choices about inclusivity of growth, about redressing poverty, about creating jobs, ensuring that the fruits and the benefits of growth accrue to all Nigerians. I think the policymakers have listened to this discussion. I hope they have. And I'm sure that we would tailor policies towards producing inclusive growth. See you next week.